Good evening. I'd like to begin tonight describing a scenario that's all too familiar in American society today. There's a group of reporters sitting out in the audience, and there's a podium up front. Suddenly, a man or woman comes to the podium, stands in front of it, and says, "I will now take questions." Every reporter's hand in the room shoots up. He points to one reporter, and the reporter asks, "Sir, how do you respond to the charges against you?" And the man standing at the podium takes a deep breath and says, "I can neither confirm nor deny the allegations presented against me." This phrase, "I can neither confirm nor deny," has become almost the boilerplate, non-denial denial of our time. But who came up with this phrase? Why did they come up with it? For what purpose was it created? But most importantly, how is this phrase being used today in the context in which it was originally created? Well, in the 1960s, the United States and the Soviet Union were engaged in a Cold War. That was not really so cold. In the Pacific Ocean, the Soviets and the United States were constantly maneuvering their nuclear submarines, trying to gain a slight advantage on one another, testing response times and testing their defenses. The reason for this was that in the event of an all-out nuclear exchange, the slightest advantage could mean the difference between victory and defeat. So, in the pursuit of these small advantages, there was a situation that arose. In March of 1968, a Russian nuclear submarine called the K-129 vanished without a trace. To this day, we still have no idea why, but needless to say, the submarine sank to the bottom of the ocean. So the Russians sent their ships out, and they went looking. They were not able to find the wreck, but the United States sent their ships out, and they were able to find the wreck. Again, we're not really sure how, but it's largely assumed the United States possessed some sort of superior sonar or ocean floor mapping technology that allowed them to find it. But needless to say, they found it, and they had an interest in getting inside of it. They wanted the code books, and they wanted the nuclear warheads. If they got a hold of the nuclear warheads, they could see what kind of technology the Russians had. So they wanted to raise it to the surface. But there was a problem. The submarine was 3 miles below the surface of the ocean, and at that depth, the pressure is 7,500 pounds per square inch, which means the CIA and the Navy would somehow have to devise a way to lift 14 million pounds. So the CIA and the Navy get a group of very intelligent individuals together to brainstorm ideas on how to do this. This was codenamed Project Azorian. And they came up with a number of ideas, but the one they settled on was a giant claw. This claw would go down to the bottom of the ocean, grab the submarine, and pull it up to the surface. So they had their idea, and they had their location. But they needed a cover story. You can't try an operation like this, of this magnitude and of this scale, and not draw a lot of public attention. So they needed a Loctite cover story. So they reached out to infamous and eccentric billionaire Howard Hughes. Now, and they asked him, "Mr. Hughes, would you be willing to say through one of your companies that you now have a sudden interest in get this manganese mining on the floor of the ocean?" Kid you not, manganese mining on the floor of the ocean. Needless to say, he agreed, and it was the perfect cover story for the CIA. If you know anything about Mr. Hughes, he was rather infamous for his outlandish ideas. So now they had the location, they had their idea of how they were going to get it, and they had their cover story. So they went about constructing this ship. And 6 years later, in 1974, the ship was complete. And the ship was called the Hughes Glomar Explorer. Glomar comes from one of the companies that helped build the ship called Global Marine. Global Marine, Glomar. There you have it. So they went out, needless to say, with the ship. The claw went down. It grabbed a hold of the submarine. But as it was pulling the submarine to the surface, something went wrong. And the submarine essentially fell apart. And the claw was only able to recover a small piece of the submarine. This small piece did not contain the code books, nor did it contain the nuclear weapons. At the same time this was all happening, the story was starting to break in the media. Reporters were asking questions, calling the CIA, asking what's going on, and the CIA had to develop and think about how they were going to respond to this, which brings our story to, as you might assume, an attorney. His name was Walt Logan. He was the Associate General Counsel at the Central Intelligence Agency. And as you might be thinking, Walt Logan is not his real name. It was an alias that he was assigned when he joined the agency. So, Mr. Logan was assigned with the task of developing a response to this. But it sounds simple, but it was not so simple. The reason for this is the United States did not want the Soviets to know what they had or had not found. It was in the United States government's best interest to have the Russians nervous, have them off balance. Another key issue was that the Freedom of Information Act had been passed several years prior. The Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA as it's commonly known, requires that the United States government, or requires that if citizens, United States citizens, request documents from the government is legally obligated to respond and provide those documents. So, because of FOIA, Walt could not lie. He had to tell the truth. But there was another problem. Every employee of the Central Intelligence Agency, when they join, swears an oath to uphold what's called the intelligence sources and methods, basically saying that they will not reveal state secrets. So Walt had a problem. On the one hand, he could not lie because of FOIA, but on the other hand, he could not reveal state secrets because of his oath. So he was in sort of a rock and a hard place. Now, keep in mind that the CIA had been working on developing a response for months, and they'd come up with nothing, which is why they brought Walt in. Now, there's not a whole lot known about Walt, obviously, because of the classified material, but he did do one interview. And in this interview, he is actually quoted as saying that it took him 30 minutes to draft the Glomar response. One attorney working for 30 minutes has frustrated and tortured lawyers and journalists for 40 years. Think about that for a moment. One attorney working for 30 minutes has caused all of this. So, needless to say, as you can see by his response, he achieved his objective. He told the truth, as he was obligated under FOIA, and he did not reveal anything, as he was obligated under his oath. Since this time, use of this phrase, "I can neither confirm nor deny," has exploded. You now have famous individuals and celebrities using it. You have characters in TV shows and movies using it. And you even have politicians like former Congressman Anthony Weiner using it to respond to allegations of inappropriate text messages. Now, when the CIA joined Twitter in 2014, this was their first tweet. Clearly, its use has expanded way beyond what Walt Logan originally thought it would. But not only has it expanded in the public sphere, it's also expanded in the realm of FOIA. More and more agencies, federal agencies, are beginning to use FOIA in response, or beginning to use Glomar in response to FOIA. Now, there's the obvious agencies you would think about, the CIA, the FBI, DEA, they all use it, but then there's the agencies you probably don't think about that have used it. Department of Energy, Department of Commerce, Department of the Treasury, even the Center for Disease Control have all issued a Glomar response to a FOIA request. Now, part of the reasoning for this is that the courts of the United States judiciary give Glomar a huge, an incredible amount of deference. When Glomar was first challenged by a group of lawyers shortly after it was created, the judge, these group of attorneys and journalists said that, Your Honor, you have to force the CIA to hand over these documents as required by FOIA. The judge denied their request, and his reasoning was that national security interests superseded the government's obligation to abide by FOIA. This created a problem. And not only did it create a problem, it created a precedent that has continued to this day. In 40 years of Glomar, not a single court case, you will not find a single court case in which the government overturned Glomar and compelled the agency to hand over the documents that were being requested. Not only has the use of Glomar expanded in federal agencies, but it's expanded in state agencies as well. In 2014, a mosque in New York City issued a FOIA request to the New York Police Department requesting documents that would reveal whether or not their mosque was being monitored. The NYPD issued a Glomar response. The mosque sued, went to court, and in the first time ever, a judge approved the use of Glomar by a state agency for the same reasons it was originally intended, for national security interests. He claimed that terrorism was a national security interest and therefore allowed a state agency to use Glomar. The problem with this is that this high level of deference allows federal and now state agencies to overstep their legal authority without any concern that they will be reprimanded for it. They know they can overstep, and if an individual files a FOIA for documents that would reveal that they have overstepped their legal authority, all they have to do is simply issue a Glomar response, and they're protected, they're safe. Nowhere is this more evident than in the recent Edward Snowden documents. In these documents, Edward Snowden provides clear and convincing evidence that the National Security Agency overstepped its legal authority and instituted a global surveillance program that included American citizens. This raises an important question. If the National Security Agency is overstepping their legal authority and using Glomar to defend themselves and to shield themselves from scrutiny, what other agencies are doing the exact same thing? Now, FOIA was created several years before Glomar, but FOIA didn't become what we know it today until after the Watergate scandal. After Watergate, Americans' mistrust in the government was at historic highs. So Congress beefed up FOIA and gave it some teeth in order to rebuild trust with the American public and to provide a more transparent and open government. The excessive use of Glomar by state agencies and federal agencies completely and utterly destroys any sense of transparency that FOIA was designed to create. So you may be thinking, what can I do? How can we change this? And therein lies another problem. There's really only two ways to change how Glomar is being used in FOIA requests. The judiciary has to overturn Glomar in a case and set a precedent for when Glomar can be used, or our legislature has to pass a law outlining the specific circumstances when Glomar can be used. The reality is, neither one of those things is likely to happen. The real travesty, though, is that your average American citizen has absolutely no idea that this is even happening. Only a small fraction of the American population even knows what the Freedom of Information Act is, and a smaller fraction of that small fraction has ever filed a FOIA request and received a Glomar response. There is one thing I want each and every member of the audience tonight to walk out of here knowing, is that this process and system of filing a FOIA, receiving a Glomar, filing a FOIA, receiving a Glomar, suppresses our fundamental rights as American citizens. The famed philosopher and activist Rosa Luxemburg once said, "He who does not move does not notice his chains." But after tonight, you all have been moved and you all know of the chains. Thank you.